The moment she walked through the glass doors, the entire room decided who she was without saying her name. At exactly 10:14 a.m. on a clear New York morning, Ava Johnson stepped into an upscale boutique on Madison Avenue, the kind of place where every detail whispered luxury and every glance measured worth. She wore a simple cream coat, plain black trousers, and minimal accessories, nothing that carried a visible logo or signal of status, and for most people inside, that absence spoke louder than anything else. Behind the polished counter stood Chloe Bennett, the boutique manager, a woman trained to recognize wealth by appearance alone, and the first thing she did was pause, glance at Ava from her shoes to her face, and offer a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Can I help you? Or are you just browsing?" she asked, already assuming the answer. Ava's expression remained calm, unreadable, as she looked around the boutique slowly, taking in the glass displays, the soft lighting, and the quiet attention of staff who had subtly shifted their focus toward her. "I'm here to see the new collection," she said evenly, her voice steady, unbothered by the shift in tone around her. Chloe exchanged a quick look with one of the associates, a silent communication that needed no words, and within seconds Ava was being guided, not to the main collection, but toward a quieter corner of the store, where discounted pieces were usually displayed, even though she had not requested it. No one stopped to ask if she preferred it. No one questioned the assumption, because assumptions, in places like this, often carried the weight of protocol. A young associate named Emily Parker noticed the exchange and hesitated, her eyes briefly locking onto Ava's face as if trying to place her from somewhere she had seen before, but she said nothing, stepping back into silence instead. Meanwhile, Chloe continued speaking in a tone that was polite on the surface but firm underneath, explaining policies, membership tiers, and appointment requirements that had never been mentioned to Ava before. "We usually recommend booking in advance for private viewings," she added, her words careful, layered with implication. Around them, other customers began to notice the interaction, a few lifting their phones slightly, not openly recording but capturing fragments, the way people do when they sense something unfolding that might become worth remembering later. Ava did not react to any of it immediately. She simply stood still, hands relaxed at her sides, eyes scanning the boutique once more, as if she were assessing something far beyond the clothing racks and polished floors. There was no irritation in her expression, no visible discomfort, only a quiet stillness that made people unsure whether she was out of place or simply observing something they could not yet understand. Chloe finally gestured lightly toward the seating area near the entrance and said, "If you'd like, you can wait there while we assist our scheduled clients first." The sentence landed softly, but its meaning was not soft at all. And still, Ava said nothing, because in that moment, the room had already begun revealing itself, not to her, but to itself, and what it revealed would not stay unnoticed for long. The atmosphere inside the boutique shifted in small but noticeable ways, not through any single event, but through a growing accumulation of judgment, curiosity, and quiet discomfort. Ava Johnson remained near the same spot where she had been guided, yet the space around her no longer felt neutral. It felt measured, as if every movement she made was being silently evaluated against expectations she had never agreed to. Chloe Bennett returned from behind the counter with a tablet in her hand, scanning it briefly before speaking again, her tone now more procedural than welcoming. "We may need to verify your membership tier before we proceed further," she said, though no such verification had been requested by Ava at any point. Without waiting for a response, she gestured toward a section of the boutique where older collections were displayed, implying without words that this was a more appropriate area. A few customers nearby exchanged subtle glances, their attention no longer on their purchases, but on the unfolding interaction that had started to attract quiet interest. One woman adjusted her phone slightly, not openly recording, but clearly framing the scene through instinct rather than intent. Ava observed everything without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if she were studying not the boutique itself but the behavior of the people inside it. Emily Parker, still working at the edge of the floor, hesitated again. She had now clearly recognized something familiar about Ava, something she had seen in financial news or industry reports, but the certainty of that recognition was still forming behind hesitation. She took one small step forward, then stopped when Chloe's voice cut through the space again, firmer now, instructing her to focus on assisting verified clients. The phrase landed heavily, creating a boundary that was not physical but social, drawing an invisible line between who belonged and who was being assessed. At that moment, Ava finally took out her phone, not in urgency, but with calm precision, and sent a single brief message. Across the city, in a quiet office overlooking downtown Manhattan, Daniel Reed received it instantly. He did not ask questions. He simply reviewed the message, opened a secure interface, and activated a pre-configured response protocol linked to Johnson Holdings' Fashion Acquisition Division. "System is on standby," he said into the call without raising his voice, confirming readiness rather than reacting. Back inside the boutique, Chloe continued speaking, now explaining limited access collections and appointment-only showcases, her words designed to establish structure but increasingly functioning as barriers. Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but something about her silence began to feel different to those paying attention. It was no longer passive observation. It was calculation. A customer near the entrance leaned slightly toward another and whispered that the situation felt uncomfortable, though they could not explain exactly why. The store's background music continued softly, yet it did little to cover the tension building beneath conversation and movement. Chloe, sensing control of the situation, straightened slightly and offered a final polite suggestion. That Ava might want to browse elsewhere first before requesting premium access. The words were carefully chosen, but their implication was not subtle. And still, Ava did not respond immediately. She simply looked across the boutique once more, her eyes passing over every detail, every face, every assumption, and in that quiet moment, it became clear that the room was no longer simply judging her presence. It was unknowingly preparing for the consequences of it. The tension inside the boutique began to shift in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like a change in air pressure before a storm becomes visible. Ava Johnson remained still, but her stillness no longer blended into the environment. It now contrasted against it. Chloe Bennett, increasingly confident in her interpretation of the situation, stepped slightly closer to the display counter and adjusted her tone into something more authoritative, as if formalizing an unspoken decision. She informed Ava that certain collections required prior approval and that without verified access, her options would remain limited to general inventory. The language was polite, but the structure of it was firm, and everyone within earshot understood the message beneath the words. A few customers shifted their attention more openly now, no longer pretending to ignore the situation. One man near the front entrance lifted his phone slightly higher, framing the interaction more deliberately this time, while another whispered that this did not feel like normal customer service. Emily Parker, still standing near the side displays, felt a growing conflict between what she was observing and what she was expected to accept. She had worked in retail long enough to recognize patterns, and something about the way Ava was being treated did not align with standard procedure. Yet she remained silent, caught between uncertainty and hierarchy. Chloe, unaware of Emily's internal hesitation, continued speaking, now introducing the idea that the boutique prioritized established clientele relationships, a phrase that subtly excluded anyone who did not already fit a predefined category. Ava finally shifted her gaze slightly, not toward Chloe, but toward the room itself, as if taking in the full structure of behavior surrounding her. It was not a look of frustration or confusion. It was observational, analytical, almost detached. She stepped a fraction closer to a mirrored display, where reflections captured not only her image, but also the subtle reactions of those watching her. At that moment, her phone vibrated once. She did not immediately look at it. Instead, she allowed the silence to continue, as if measuring how long the room would maintain its current assumption before something broke it. Across Manhattan, Daniel Reed had already escalated the internal readiness status. A secure acquisition framework linked to Johnson Holdings was now active, quietly syncing with legal, financial, and brand oversight systems. No public action had been taken, but the structure was in place, waiting for authorization. Daniel sent a brief confirmation message that everything was prepared and paused only after receiving a single acknowledgement from Ava. Back inside the boutique, Chloe made one final attempt to reassert control of the interaction by suggesting that Ava might prefer visiting at a later time when appointments could be arranged properly. The statement was framed as assistance, but its effect was exclusion. A nearby customer frowned slightly, sensing the imbalance but unsure whether to intervene. Emily's expression tightened, her attention now fully focused on Ava, as fragments of recognition finally aligned in her mind, though she still hesitated to speak them aloud. The boutique remained visually unchanged, elegant lighting, soft music, polished surfaces, yet the emotional geometry of the space had shifted completely. Every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen phrase was now part of a silent structure of judgment that had begun to build around a single unanswered presence. And still, Ava said nothing, because in her silence, the situation was no longer about access or misunderstanding. It was becoming something far more precise, a record forming in real time, where every assumption being made would eventually have to stand against what came next. The boutique had settled into a strange rhythm where normal activity continued on the surface while every movement underneath it carried tension. Ava Johnson stood near the mirror display for a moment longer, her reflection blending with the reflections of dresses, lights, and distant observers who were no longer pretending not to watch. Chloe Bennett checked her tablet again, as if repetition of procedure could reinforce control over a situation that was slowly resisting it. She spoke once more, this time mentioning store guidelines regarding exclusive collections and stating that without confirmed authorization, further browsing would not be possible. Her tone remained professional, but the edges of impatience were beginning to surface, subtle but present. A few customers shifted positions, some pretending to browse while clearly listening, others no longer hiding their attention at all. One woman near the entrance whispered to her companion that she had never seen the store handle a guest this way, though she quickly lowered her voice as if concerned about being overheard. Emily Parker took another step forward, then stopped again, her internal hesitation now replaced by growing certainty that something about the situation was not aligning with what she had been trained to accept. She looked at Ava more directly now, noticing details she had overlooked before, the calm posture, the lack of reaction, the way she was not reacting like someone trying to prove anything. Instead, Ava appeared to be waiting, as if the entire sequence unfolding around her was already accounted for in advance. Chloe, sensing the need to reassert authority, approached slightly closer and suggested once again that the boutique prioritized clients who had prearranged consultations, framing the statement as standard policy rather than exclusion. The words were delivered smoothly, but their effect created a visible shift among those listening. Ava finally lowered her gaze to her phone, reading the message that had arrived moments earlier. Her expression did not change, but something in her stillness sharpened, as if a decision point had been reached internally without external display. Across Manhattan, Daniel Reed confirmed that the acquisition framework had moved from standby to active review status, meaning that any further escalation inside the boutique would now be logged and analyzed in real time by legal and executive oversight systems. No one in the store was aware of this layer operating beneath their interaction. Chloe gestured lightly toward the seating area again, reiterating that waiting might be more appropriate if Ava wished to continue at a later scheduled time. The suggestion carried the same structure as before, but now it felt more final, more closed. Emily, unable to remain silent any longer, opened her mouth slightly as if to speak, then hesitated as Chloe turned briefly in her direction, unintentionally reinforcing the hierarchy that kept her quiet. Ava placed her phone back into her hand calmly, and finally spoke a single sentence, not raised in volume, not altered in tone, but precise enough to shift attention across the entire boutique without effort. The surrounding conversation slowed, not because they were interrupted, but because they were no longer competing with each other for relevance. Chloe blinked once, unsure how to respond immediately, and for the first time since Ava entered the boutique, her certainty showed the smallest fracture. The air inside the store felt unchanged visually, yet every person inside it understood something subtle had shifted, not through confrontation, but through recognition that the assumptions guiding the moment were no longer stable. The brief silence that followed Ava Johnson's last sentence did not remain empty for long. It filled quickly with the small, uneasy sounds of a space trying to return to normal while clearly no longer able to. Chloe Bennet recovered first, adjusting her posture and lifting her tablet slightly, as if it could restore structure to what had just shifted. She smiled, but it was now controlled rather than confident, and when she spoke, her voice carried a more rigid tone. She stated that the boutique followed strict verification procedures for exclusive access pieces and that, for clarity, they would need to confirm eligibility before proceeding further. The words were framed as policy, but the delivery had changed, carrying the weight of escalation rather than service. Ava remained still, her attention steady, her expression unchanged, as if observing not the statement itself but the intent behind it. Around them, the boutique no longer felt like a retail environment. It felt like an audience had formed without permission. A man near the entrance lowered his phone slightly, no longer pretending not to record, while a woman near the accessories display tilted her camera angle more openly, capturing both sound and reaction. Emily Parker took another step forward, now visibly conflicted, her gaze moving between Chloe and Ava as if trying to reconcile procedure with instinct. She finally spoke, softly at first, suggesting that Ava's name might already be in the system under a private client category, but Chloe immediately interrupted her, stating firmly that if that were the case, it would already be visible and that speculation would not be helpful during verification. The interruption was sharp enough to silence Emily, and she stepped back again, her uncertainty now replaced by visible discomfort. Ava then looked down at her phone once more. Another message had arrived, brief and direct. Daniel Reed had confirmed that internal compliance logs were now actively tracking the interaction in real time, including all verbal escalations and procedural decisions being made inside the boutique. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she slowly lifted her gaze and looked across the store, not at any one person, but at the structure of behavior itself. Chloe, sensing that control needed to be reinforced, gestured toward the entrance and stated that if verification could not be completed, they would have to ask Ava to continue the experience elsewhere or return at a scheduled time with proper authorization. The phrasing was polite, but the implication was no longer subtle. A few customers shifted uncomfortably, and one quietly stepped aside, creating more space as if distance might reduce involvement. Emily, now fully aware of the direction the situation was moving, opened her mouth again, but no words came out, as Chloe's presence alone seemed to close the possibility of interruption. Ava finally took a slow breath and placed her phone into her pocket. When she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but it carried a clarity that immediately altered the atmosphere. She asked a simple question about who, exactly, had determined the level of access required to view a collection that was publicly listed under the boutique's seasonal release. The question was not loud, but it landed cleanly. Chloe hesitated for the first time, her eyes briefly scanning the tablet, as if searching for reinforcement. The boutique, once filled with soft ambient confidence, now held a different kind of silence, one that formed not from absence of sound, but from the realization that every assumption being made was now being quietly examined. And in that examination, nothing in the room remained untouched. The question Ava Johnson asked did not echo loudly, but it settled into the boutique with a weight that made several people instinctively stop moving. It was not a challenge in tone, yet it created a moment where the normal rhythm of the store no longer felt reliable. Chloe Bennet held her tablet slightly higher, as if preparing to reassert control through procedure rather than dialogue. She responded by stating that boutique collections were curated under specific partnership agreements and that access was determined by verified client status and appointment records. Her explanation was structured, precise, and intended to close interpretation rather than invite it. Ava listened without interruption, her gaze steady, absorbing each word as if mapping the logic behind it rather than reacting to its surface meaning. Around them, the boutique remained visually unchanged, but attention inside it had become concentrated. Customers who had previously been browsing began to slow their movements, some turning fully toward the interaction without attempting to disguise their interest anymore. Emily Parker now stood still, her earlier hesitation replaced by a growing awareness that the situation was no longer about a misunderstanding at the front desk, but about something deeper in how authority was being applied. She looked at Ava again and then at Chloe, realizing the gap between procedure and perception was widening with every sentence spoken. Chloe, noticing the shift in attention, took a small step forward and reiterated that if Ava's name could not be located within the authorized client registry, they would have to pause the interaction until proper confirmation was provided by corporate channels. The word pause was chosen carefully, but it functioned as a boundary. At that moment, Ava reached into her pocket and retrieved her phone again. The screen lit softly in her hand, and she read a single incoming message. There was no visible change in her expression, but something in her posture subtly aligned, as if a decision point had been acknowledged internally. Across Manhattan, Daniel Reed completed a secure verification step, confirming that internal governance protocols tied to Johnson Holdings' fashion division were now actively monitoring boutique-level interactions in real time, including access decisions, language used in customer interactions, and procedural escalations. No intervention had been triggered yet, but the system was no longer passive. Chloe, unaware of what was unfolding beyond the boutique's walls, attempted to reinforce structure once more by offering a final option for scheduling a private consultation through standard channels, emphasizing that this would ensure a proper experience aligned with client expectations. The phrasing was smooth, but its effect further defined separation within the room. Emily shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable now, as if she could feel the imbalance becoming harder to ignore, but still unsure where she was permitted to stand within it. Ava placed her phone back into her hand slowly and looked directly at Chloe for the first time without glancing away. Her voice, when it came, remained calm, but it carried a clarity that immediately altered the temperature of the space. She asked whether it was standard practice for a boutique operating under a publicly listed luxury brand to restrict access to items based on assumptions not reflected in the system's verified records. The question was simple, but it introduced structure into something that had been operating on assumption. Chloe hesitated, her eyes briefly returning to her tablet, searching for certainty that no longer felt immediate. The boutique, still elegant and quiet on the surface, began to feel like a space where every assumption was now being quietly held up against something it had not been prepared to answer. The question Ava Johnson asked lingered in the air longer than any single sentence should have, not because it was complicated, but because it exposed something the room had not prepared itself to articulate. Chloe Bennett felt the shift immediately, though she attempted to contain it by tightening her grip on the tablet and returning to procedural language, stating that assumptions were not part of the decision-making process and that all access restrictions were based strictly on verified client records and internal brand policy. Her words were carefully structured, but they no longer carried the same authority they had at the beginning of the interaction. Ava remained still, her attention fixed not on Chloe alone, but on the entire framework of explanation being presented to her. It was as if she was listening for consistency rather than permission. Around the boutique, the environment had subtly changed. Conversations that had once been private had dissolved entirely, replaced by quiet observation. A customer near the center display slowly lowered her hand from a rack of dresses and simply watched without pretending otherwise. Another shifted her position slightly, angling her phone in a way that suggested recording had become less accidental and more intentional. Emily Parker, standing closer now than before, felt the weight of what she was witnessing increase with every passing second. She had initially interpreted the situation as a routine misunderstanding, but the structure of the interaction no longer supported that assumption. She noticed how Ava's stillness was not passive but deliberate, how every response she gave seemed to redirect the conversation back towards something unaddressed rather than react to what was immediately said. Chloe, sensing that control needed reinforcement, attempted once again to anchor the situation in procedure, stating that boutique policy required confirmation of client eligibility before any further engagement with restricted collections could continue. The phrasing was consistent, but its effect was diminishing. Ava finally lowered her gaze briefly, not in retreat, but in consideration. She then looked up again and asked a second question, quieter than the first, asking how many instances of restricted access determinations in the boutique were audited externally versus internally. The question did not accuse, but it reframed the entire structure of authority in the room. Chloe hesitated for a fraction longer than before, her eyes flicking to the tablet, but no immediate answer followed. That silence created space where certainty had previously existed. Across Manhattan, Daniel Reed reviewed a live compliance feed showing that boutique-level decision logs were now being mirrored into a centralized oversight system connected to Johnson Holdings' governance architecture. No intervention had been issued, but every escalation, every refusal, every classification was now being recorded with timestamps and language tagging. Back inside the boutique, Emily finally spoke, her voice cautious but audible, suggesting that there might have been a system update regarding client categorization that not all floor staff had been fully briefed on. Her statement was not a contradiction, but it introduced uncertainty into what had been presented as fixed procedure. Chloe turned toward her briefly, her expression tightening, and reminded her that operational updates were not relevant to immediate client interaction protocols. The correction was sharp enough to silence further input. Ava observed this exchange without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her attention now clearly focused on the structure of control within the space rather than any single individual. The boutique lighting remained soft, the environment carefully designed to communicate calm exclusivity, yet beneath it, the rhythm of interaction had shifted into something more fragile. Every explanation now required reinforcement. Every statement carried the risk of contradiction. And every assumption felt increasingly exposed to scrutiny that had not been present at the beginning. And still, Ava did not raise her voice or move closer. She simply remained present, allowing the structure around her to continue revealing itself without resistance, until what was unspoken in the room began to weigh more than everything that had already been said. The silence inside the boutique no longer felt like hesitation. It now felt like anticipation of something inevitable, as if the room itself had begun to understand that every exchange up to this point was moving toward a conclusion it could not prevent. Ava Johnson stood in the same position, yet the perception of her presence had changed completely. She was no longer being evaluated as a visitor or a client, but as a fixed point around which everything else was beginning to lose stability. Chloe Bennett attempted to regain control by returning to her tablet, but the device now seemed less like an instrument of authority and more like a record of decisions that were no longer fully convincing even to her. She stated again that boutique policy required immediate clarification of client status before any continued access could be granted, but her voice carried a strain that had not been present earlier. Around her, the environment began to fracture in subtle but undeniable ways. A notification appeared on Chloe's tablet, and for the first time, she paused before reading it aloud. It was not a customer message. It was an internal compliance alert indicating that all interactions involving access restriction decisions were now being reviewed in real time by corporate governance oversight. The phrase alone changed the temperature of the space. Emily Parker saw it first, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized the implications of such a system activation. It meant that every word spoken, every refusal, every classification was now being evaluated beyond the boutique itself. Chloe hesitated, then continued speaking, but her tone had lost its earlier certainty. She explained that the boutique was cooperating fully with internal standards review processes, though the phrasing suggested that cooperation was no longer optional. Ava remained still, watching the shift unfold without interruption. She did not react to the notification or the change in tone. Instead, she looked at Chloe as if observing the final stage of a pattern she had already identified. The customers who had been quietly watching now appeared fully engaged, some stepping back slightly, others holding their phones more openly. The atmosphere had transitioned from curiosity to awareness. Emily finally spoke again, more firmly this time, stating that the system notification indicated escalation beyond store-level authority, and that decisions made in the moment might be subject to immediate audit reversal. Chloe turned sharply toward her, but before she could respond, another notification appeared, this time accompanied by a brief confirmation tone from the tablet. Chloe read it silently, and for the first time, her expression shifted into visible uncertainty. The message confirmed that boutique access protocols had been temporarily suspended pending executive-level review. No explanation followed. No clarification was provided. Only suspension. The effect was immediate. The The structured authority Chloe had been relying on no longer had operational backing. She lowered the tablet slightly, as if its weight had increased. Ava finally took a small step forward, not toward Chloe, but toward the center of the boutique, and in doing so, every person in the room subtly adjusted their attention toward her. She spoke only one sentence, calm and measured, asking who now held final authority over client classification in a system that had just been paused by its own governance layer. The question did not demand an answer, but it removed the remaining illusion of certainty from the space. Chloe did not respond immediately. Emily did not either. And in that absence of response, the boutique reached a point where its internal structure of control no longer appeared stable enough to support the assumptions that had defined every interaction up to that moment. The question Ava Johnson asked did not fade. It expanded, filling the boutique in a way that no one inside could ignore anymore. The absence of an immediate answer created a vacuum that changed the emotional structure of the room. Chloe Bennett stood behind the counter, her tablet still in hand, but now it felt less like a tool of authority and more like an object waiting for instructions it could no longer provide. The earlier confidence that had defined her posture was gone, replaced by a careful stillness that suggested uncertainty about what came next. Ava remained exactly where she was, her presence unchanged, but the perception of her had shifted completely. She was no longer being treated as a visitor, nor even as a client in question. She had become the reference point against which the entire system of behavior inside the boutique was now being measured. Emily Parker stood slightly behind Chloe, her expression tense but focused, as if she was trying to interpret the situation through layers of training that no longer seemed sufficient. She finally spoke, carefully stating that when a governance-level suspension occurs, authority typically defaults to corporate compliance until reinstatement is confirmed. Her voice was quiet, but it carried further than she intended, because it was the first time anyone inside the boutique had acknowledged that control had moved beyond the room itself. Chloe turned toward her, but did not immediately respond, as another notification appeared on her tablet. She looked at it, then paused longer than before, and for the first time, she did not attempt to summarize it aloud. The message confirmed that all boutique-level decisions regarding access, classification, and client eligibility were now under executive review, and that no further exclusions could be enforced until clearance was restored. The implication was clear enough that no additional explanation was required. A few customers shifted subtly, no longer pretending to browse, their attention fully fixed on the exchange. One person near the entrance lowered their phone slightly, realizing that what had started as a moment of curiosity had become something more structurally significant. Ava finally took another step forward, slow and deliberate, not toward any individual, but into the center of the space where all lines of interaction converged. She looked at Chloe and then at Emily, her expression unchanged, but her presence now defining the room in a way that no spoken instruction had achieved. She asked one final question, asking what policy remained enforceable in a system where access control had been suspended at the executive level, and whether any decisions made under the assumption of restricted eligibility still carried operational validity. The question was not raised in frustration or confrontation. It was delivered with precision, and that precision removed the last remaining layer of ambiguity. Chloe did not answer immediately. Emily did not either. The boutique, once structured around clear assumptions of hierarchy and control, now stood in a state where every rule it had relied on was temporarily undefined. And in that undefined space, Ava remained the only constant, not because she had asserted dominance, but because everything around her had quietly stopped being certain enough to define her otherwise.